Dinosaur, written by Stephen Llewelyn and performed by Chris Barrie. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell to keep up to date with the latest installments.
Chapter 1. I'll Leave You in Hell.
Do you wish us to acquire the item, sir?
The old man sat motionless behind his extravagantly carved desk, staring dispassionately at the academics. It was obvious that the balding, middle-aged man standing before him was desperately trying not to wring his hands. The woman, younger and clearly of sterner material, returned his gaze without emotion. The old man enjoyed the fear in the scientist's demeanor. He let him sweat a moment longer before shaking his head.
No, Doctor. Simply knowing of the artifact's existence is enough. For now. I authorize your project and whatever assets you require.
He raised a wry eyebrow.
We are attempting to save the human race, after all, are we not?
Yes, sir,
replied the petitioner, experimenting briefly with tucking his hands into the pockets of his lab coat, but removing them at once, hoping the action had not been perceived as slovenly or disrespectful. The old man scrutinized him once more, coldly feline. He wondered whether it would be more expedient to simply replace him immediately, or wait to see if he could pull himself together once the process began. His master's approval given, the fellow appeared more nervous than before. The woman spoke for the first time, interrupting his musings. A flash of annoyance crossed his face, but she continued undeterred.
We are 2 years away from a working prototype, sir, 2112 at the earliest. All of our tests so far have destroyed the drives completely.
He eyed her for a moment. Still she held his gaze. Eventually he nodded slowly.
Very well, doctors. In that case, I had better not keep you.
Slight pressure on a sensor in the arm of his chair made it rotate away from them and towards the view over the remnant rainforest around his fortress. The meeting was over. He watched with satisfaction as the scientists bowed before leaving, reflected in the curved glass of the window wall. After the door closed behind them, he waved a hand over another sensor in the chair's arm to activate an intercom link to his personal aid.
Yes, sir?
The woman's response was immediate, her voice projected from sound plates artfully concealed within the exquisitely carved jet wall paneling. The panels were inlaid with gold etching, the sound perfectly balanced to center upon him wherever he happened to be within his large study and inner sanctum. The vastly expensive electronics removed any trace of echo or destructive interference. He could eavesdrop on locations all over the world from here with equal clarity. However, the source of this particular voice happened to be in the next room.
I wish to see my granddaughter. Tell her to book a few days' vacation. I will expect her tomorrow, he stated peremptorily.
Yes, sir. Is there anything else I can do for you?
The old man considered.
Yes. Get me a full report on the boy. I wish to check his progress. That will be all.
At once, sir.
He closed the connection mid-salutation, continuing his survey of one of the last surviving pockets of the natural world. And it was all his. He nodded contentedly. A human being, unprotected, would be lucky to survive even an hour out there now. The creeping, crawling creatures of the forest became more aggressive each year. It was almost as though they sensed their environment being taken away from them, and nature had programmed them to fight back, turning normally dangerous creatures murderous. It certainly deterred visitors. Mother Nature abhorred weakness.
As I do.
The old man completed the thought aloud.
All is as it should be.
He considered the full ramifications of the project he had just set in motion for a moment longer, and then leaned forward slightly. Placing an elbow on the arm of his chair, he cradled his chin with a thumb and forefinger. Frowning in concentration, his thoughts turned towards the boy. AD 2112, England. It was a milestone in the life of Tim Norris. Recently turned 16, he was leaving school today. However, his mind was, as it often was, somewhere else, because in just a few days he would also be leaving Earth. "Am I interrupting your daydream, Mr. Norris?" his teacher broke into his reverie. Startled, Tim rallied quickly. "No more than usual, miss." Some of his classmates sniggered, and Mrs. Montgomery smiled indulgently at the young man. "This is the last time I'm going to be able to say this to you. Pay attention." "And for the last time, yes, miss," he replied, returning her smile. He liked Mrs. Montgomery, which made her fairly anomalous to his general schooling experience. Regardless, he leaned back toward his windowsill, the one against which he had propped himself for the past 4 years, and slipped right back into Tim world. Taking a deep breath of recycled air, he could taste metal as he gazed out over the concrete and the smog, pondering the many little steps mankind had taken over the last 40 years, all leading up to the voyage he was about to make. Yes, it's for the best, he thought. Over the last 18 months, Tim's adoptive mother, Dr. Patricia Norris, had fought tooth and nail to secure a place for them both on the next life pod mission to Mars. Her dedication, driven by poverty and the need to provide a future for her son, had eventually been rewarded. As the date of their departure drew near, just a few more days now, the relief and gratitude he felt left him almost lightheaded. His teacher knew they were going. Tim had told no one. The media hype was intensifying towards a crescendo. Even the often cynical Mrs. Montgomery had not been entirely immune. The school leavers' lessons had officially ended, so the teacher used her remaining hours with them to fill the large screen built into the glass wall at the front of the classroom with images, statistics, and footage relating to the Mars program. "I know it began a little before your time," she said, "but I'm sure you're all aware that human beings have maintained a presence on Mars since early 2095. She pointed at a simplified map of Mars as an indicator appeared on the screen, drawing the class's attention. "During the last 17 years, 4 small townships of modular interconnected life pods have grown up, managing the planet's atmospheric conversion to eventually support complex life. The 50-year terraforming program is being led by NASA, working alongside international partners in Germany, New Zealand, Australia, Italy, Japan, India, and, of course, us here in Britain. Now, as we all know, because the news feeds talk of little else these days, the mining and resource industries of the mid to late 21st century took massive leaps forward. They had to, as they were driven ever on by the combined pressures of scarcity and commercial requirement. It is perhaps ironic that this rape of the earth, as it was and still is seen by many, brought about and drove the very technology which now provides hope for Mars, the hope of resurrection from a frozen celestial grave. Tim could feel his excitement growing, his tummy aflutter with butterflies as he felt escape drawing within his grasp. Technically, he was now part of the Mars program, so he knew all this stuff anyway. Had been following it long before their opportunity knocked, in fact. As head of the microbiology department, his mother would be a senior member of the mission. He was immensely proud of this, of course, but most importantly, it would give him first-hand access to knowledge and information. No more piecing together fact fragments, bagpiped through the media news ringer. He couldn't wait to fully immerse himself. Back in 2072, just a few short decades before he was born, mankind had stepped into a larger universe after the first ever successful manipulation of a wormhole. It had changed everything. As if following his thoughts, Mrs. Montgomery called up an image of the world-famous wormhole drive system on the screen. "After several false starts," she continued, "NASA, with wonderfully American belief and vision, in conjunction with internationally drained brains, managed to send a probe through an artificial wormhole all the way to the Oort cloud, all within an infinitely small fraction of a second real time. The project scientists worried and waited for several days for a return signal. Needless to say, the probe's message finally reached Earth and a massive party at NASA ensued.
Indeed, the asset's secondary mission to scan a segment of the Oort cloud seems to have disappeared into the trash can of history. All anyone remembers is this. She turned back to face the class. That was the day science fiction became reality, and once the hangovers had been Alka-Seltzered away, a few of the teenagers giggled dutifully. They got back down to work. Further probe missions followed this astonishing breakthrough. Suddenly, our solar system was being explored within timeframes previously believed impossible. Crucially, these latter models were capable of piloting themselves back in the same way. Within a few short years of these successes, the Mars colonization program went from conception to birth to growth. Tim's head buzzed as the history drew him in, crystallizing the moment. Peripherally, he watched the clock creep closer to the final bell, which, as far as he was concerned, could not come quickly enough. He fully expected his classmates to cheer or dissolve into tears, promising each other that, "Of course we will stay in touch and always be best friends." He was already on Mars in his mind. His attention drifted again as he looked around his contemporaries, wondering if he might miss any of them. He noticed that the boy in front of him, a minor bully named McGovern, had dropped his smog mask again. He never secured it properly to his bag, and had been called back almost daily by the teacher to retrieve it. Maybe the extra smog he inhaled explained why he was so stupid? Tim could not help smirking as McGovern kicked the respirator under his desk without noticing. Surreptitiously, Tim nudged it just a little further out of sight with his own foot. While enjoying this tiny triumph, it occurred to him that he understood the millions of years dead more than the living always had. His focus switched to the girl, the one all the lads chased after. Her name was Trixie, and against all school rules she had several tattoos. Being neither sporty nor in any way cool, Tim had never caught her notice. Other than the occasional withering remark, he couldn't remember her ever speaking to him. Yep, they were all a whole nother country, these people. At least he always had the past. In a very real sense, it was his future too. It was his life. Paleontology was an obsession shared with and nurtured by his adoptive father, and a tool of rebellion against conformity for Tim. He revelled in a whole universe that none of them understood. Recent events focused his latest fantasy on the chance discovery of a fossil on Mars. What a splash that would make! Evidence of complex life from another world, locked in stone since before Mars lost its oceans and most of its atmosphere 2.9 billion years ago. He could already hear the headlines. That would probably put him right up there with Darwin. All that attention, he shuddered. Maybe not. His gaze was drawn toward the factory where his father had worked, until the accident. He could see it clearly from his 20th floor window. Ted Norris had been the only father he had ever known, and he would never forget that awful day. His emotions threatened to overwhelm him, so he tore his eyes away from that hated building and suppressed them as he had learned to do. Realigning his thoughts, he returned to the present and the extraordinary opportunity he had been handed. "Bring it on!" he said out loud, startling the young man next to him out of his own daydream. Distracted by past sorrows and future prospects, he had completely lost track of time, and when the final bell rang, it took him by surprise. In a surreal moment, this classroom full of freshly minted adults looked from one to another as if unsure what to do or how to feel. Gradually a ragged cheer erupted, closely followed by some tears. Tim wished a few people well as he waited for the room to clear. Eventually, he was alone with Mrs. Montgomery. "Thank you for not telling anyone, miss," he said. Seated on a raised dais at the front of the classroom, she looked down from her desk with a mixture of pride and sadness. "I think it would have been nice to let your classmates know you're going to Mars, Tim. You'll soon be famous after all." Tim shrugged shyly. "I don't want to be. I've spent years trying to stay off the radar of the bullies and popular types. I'd hate to blow all that hard work on my last day. I expected the school to be overrun with press this afternoon. They would have let your cat out of the bag, eh?" Her eyes glistened as she studied him. "I dare say, but there are bound to be loads of rich kids about to become part of this program. I'm sure they'll all be more interesting than me," he chuckled. "Anyway, I'm glad they didn't come. Montgomery sighed. Tim, you should have more faith in yourself. Your mum, Patricia, was brilliant too, an extraordinary mind. She didn't believe in herself enough either, but it appears she managed to overcome that particular obstacle in the end. Look what she's achieved now.
You taught my mum?
Taught your... How old do you think I am? She shook her head, adding witheringly, Don't answer that. No, we were here at the same time, although she was a couple of years below me. Some of our older teachers taught her, though. They'll be over the moon when word gets around of her success.
She's still broke, miss.
A transitional drawback. She's on track now and deserves everything she's won, after all she's been through. However, I think you might even surpass her. She stepped down, placing a hand on his shoulder. I've got high hopes for you, Tim.
My report matrices would seem to disagree,
Tim could not help noting. Your report cards have always said the same thing. A brilliant mind won't push himself. Tim shrugged again.
I just do what I do, miss.
Montgomery gave him a look of exasperation, but she could never remain cross with Tim for long. She had never acquired the knack. Softening to a kindly smile, she gazed at this young man, grown up in her care, quite possibly for the last time, as she said, Please keep in touch, will you? Our list of successful alumni is pretty thin in this place. It will be a joy to follow your life on Mars. I hope it will inspire some of these other kids to do well themselves too. What do you say? A hunted expression crossed Tim's face. An hour later, Patricia welcomed Tim home to their housing cell. 4 boxy rooms within a block of hundreds of cells, similar to hundreds of thousands of other blocks all over the planet. How was it, sweetheart? She asked sympathetically, remembering her own last day at school.
It was fine. Glad it's over, really,
he replied bravely. Were there any reporters?
No, Mrs. Montgomery was expecting them, but none came.
Seeing his mother's look of disappointment, he added,
I'm relieved, really. I didn't want to be grilled and photographed. You know me. Honestly, Mum, it's fine.
Never mind. That's their loss. Maybe they'll take more interest when yours are among the very first exam results communicated to Mars for the public record. Well, the time's here at last. Still sure you want to do this? She asked, referring to their rapidly approaching departure. Tim nodded enthusiastically.
Oh, yeah. You know, Mum, I just want to say thanks.
Patricia was slightly thrown by this bolt from the blue. For what? She asked cautiously.
For working so hard to get us this placement. I know how tough it's been. The 100-hour weeks and going without to keep up the payments for my education.
He grinned cheekily.
Of course, I always suspected you might be a genius. Nice to have some proof at last, though.
She cuffed him playfully and pulled him to her, amazed at how much she had to look up at him these days. Tim hugged her back. A very rare event since the teens had struck.
It's all going to be okay now, Mum, isn't it?
He asked quietly into her shoulder. She squeezed her eyes closed against a tear. I promise, was all she could manage, hiding in the hug. Cape Canaveral, USA. Across the world, it happened to be a milestone in the life of James Douglas, too. At 50 years old, he was certainly not leaving school, but he was about to leave Earth in a few days, again. The significance of the briefing scheduled for that morning could not have been foreseen. Although otherwise routine, it was actually to be his last, and, unlike previous mission briefings, was in no way preparatory for what was to come. Douglas was a Scotsman harking from Hawick in the Borders. His position within NASA carried authority and respect in measure, but having just awoken, he sat on the side of his bed as all men everywhere. He rubbed his face a bit, mussed his hair a bit, yawned a bit, and finally stood, stretching. He walked into the bathroom and splashed a little water on his face, dispelling the last vestiges of the dreadful hours. Looking in the mirror, he continued to greet the day, just like billions of other men around the world, with a shave, a shower, and etc. 15 minutes later, he was clad in a crisp, freshly ironed uniform, and reaching for one of his dress jackets from the hanger. He smiled slightly, proudly buffing his captain's insignia. The patch on the sleeve gave him a moment's pause. It was sewn onto the upper left arm,
deep blue with a diagonal white cross stitched into the motif. Douglas allowed his mind to travel home for a few moments, before donning the jacket, lingering on a past life flying for the RAF. He had few regrets. Picking up his officer's hat, he gave it a jaunty little tap into place and checked his appearance one last time in the mirror. Content that his shirt was tucked in, his tie straight, he made for the door. Suitably suited, booted and abluted, he left his quarters to catch one of the runabout buses ever zipping around Canaveral Spaceport and Airbase. He arrived at Mission Control in minutes and waded through the security treacle, a necessary misery of modernity. It seemed there was always someone who needed to be kept at arm's length. For the Canaveral security staff, if it wasn't terrorists, it was activists, and if not activists, then tourists. Slowly, Douglas proceeded. Construction work meant that staff and military personnel were temporarily forced to wait in line with everyone else to enter the complex. Inching towards his scheduled appointment and trying to remain patient, Douglas noticed one of his oldest friends further back in the queue. He had known Captain Arnold Bessel most of his life. He caught Bessel's eye, making a forward motion with his hand and then miming a drink, meaning after the meeting they were both to attend. Bessel grinned, replying with a thumbs-up gesture. While distracted, he was hit from behind by a giant suitcase with a large I Heart New York sticker on the side. Bessel straightened his hat, turning to give the impatient tourist an earful. Douglas turned away too, his shoulders rocking with laughter. After a few moments, his thoughts returned to the appointment ahead. These briefings were a fact of life for men like Douglas and Bessel. But as with every humdrum thing we humans take for granted in our daily routines, there comes a time when we do something for the last time. It is rare that we recognize these little milestones. James didn't realize either. 1 week later, Canaveral Spaceport. Launch Day. The last life pod to leave for Mars saw Canaveral awash with families, well-wishers, spectators and press. All the passengers and many of the crew waited in the departure lounge. Most of the colonists attempted to steady their nerves, hoping to make good first impressions upon people with whom they might possibly spend the rest of their lives on Mars. Population 5,106. Theirs was not merely the last pod, but the last factory pod to leave as part of the first wave of colonization, and would boost the total permanent Martian population up to 5,208. Tim stayed close to his mother, observing the diversity of his fellow pioneers. He spotted a few other teenagers among the group and speculated nervously on whether this was a good thing. The group were very much multinational, and doubtless there would be all sorts of adjustments to make for everyone. Tim wondered whether all of them realized this yet. The good old English language appeared to be providing a reliable lingua franca, allowing respectable levels of communication among all parties. However, he could not help noting that the Americans and the Australians, whilst each speaking their own perfectly understandable version of English, seemed to have some difficulty in understanding one another. He had filed their dialect mashing under possibly entertaining, when he spotted a lad who seemed to wear a near-constant grin of amusement. He also wore a New Zealand shirt, and appeared to be about Tim's age. The other teenaged male among the group, perhaps slightly older than Tim, appeared subdued, as did the pretty girl who stood beside him. She was maybe 3 or 4 years the young man's junior. He assumed them to be American, although he had only heard the older male in their party, probably the father, speak. He caught his breath when he spotted his other contemporary. Forget Trixie, there had been no girls like that at his school. He would have noticed. Patricia caught him gawking and prodded him mischievously. "Nervous?" she asked. Tim's voice croaked. He cleared his throat, pulling himself together. No, of course not, Mum. You?" Slightly embarrassed, he willed himself to stop staring at the stunning blonde and stared up in admiration at the USS New World instead. This was the ship that would carry them to their new home. The day may have been grey, but to Tim's eager eyes she stood magnificent on the strip, despite the hellscape background. A technological marvel, waiting patiently to whisk them away to lives very different from the ones they had known.
Dinosaur, written by Stephen Llewelyn and performed by Chris Barrie. New installments uploaded each week. Subscribe for more. Visit the link in the description for free New World companion stories, available for download as ebooks.